So today we have with us Tish Sanghera. She's a Pulitzer Center grantee. She's worked before with India Spend. She's worked extensively on the environment, the economy, and society, and the intersection of all of those. And she'll hopefully be able to pass on some really cool learnings from her work and also give you a bit of information about how journalism in the environment space actually works. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tish. Over to you. And guys, just same ground rules. If you have any questions, do send them into either Vaishnavi or me privately, and we'll take questions at the end. Yeah, over to you, Tish.
Cool, thank you. I'm just gonna start the presentation and share my screen. 1 second. Okay. Well, yeah, firstly, thank you very much for having me for this session. I'm really excited to see so many of you who are interested in learning about how to write about the environment or maybe improve the way you're already writing about the environment. It's such an important beat, and you know, it's a story of our lifetime. So I really, I'm great to see so many faces here. I'll just give you an overview about the session before we start off. So yeah, I'll be telling you where to look for environment stories and how to find stories which are appealing to editors and also to a wider audience, and how to make these stories engaging and appealing to a large number of people, how to use new tools to make these stories engaging. And then also some of the hurdles and pitfalls you may come across when you start your reporting or embark on that ambitious project. As Surya mentioned, I was a Pulitzer Center grantee, and for that I worked on a project called Environment Undone for about a year. It was an investigative series, so I'll just give you a case study of that towards the end of the session, so you can see the genesis of a project and how it works from beginning to end. And then I'll leave some time for a Q&A as well. So please keep any questions you have to the end. A little bit about me before we get going. Yeah, I'm an independent journalist, which means, as Suri mentioned, I freelance for a lot of Indian and international outlets as well. I call myself a self-taught journalist because I didn't actually go to journalism school. I started in the communications field. And then when I moved to India about 2 years ago, I started off as an intern at India Spend. I just emailed them out of the blue and said, I really want to do this. So that's kind of where I learned the skills to go out on the field and where to find stories. And the reason I bring that up is because if any of you are interested in reporting and doing journalism, I want you to know that it's totally something you can do without having to do a degree on it. And all you need is a bit of passion and kind of a lot of research skills and just basic writing, really. And if any of you want to reach out to me after the session at any time in the future, you can contact me on Twitter. My DMs are open. There's my handle, and also on LinkedIn. Yeah, feel free to get in touch anytime, and maybe we can collaborate. I'm very open to hearing from you guys. So yeah, so you're clearly all passionate about the environment, and you're probably thinking, where do I find stories? So one thing I always say is to literally look on your doorstep. We are, all of us living in this planet, we all have a relationship with the environment, and in India, sadly, we probably all don't live very far away from a polluted environment as well. So there are a lot of issues which we can grapple with very easily. You may also think that if you live in a small town, you know, outside of a big metro city, who's going to care about what's going on here? But I would really say that's the opposite, and that's an opportunity if you live maybe in a slightly remote area, especially now during the pandemic. A lot of us are living at home with parents or, you know, away from expensive cities. There is so much relevant news happening that people are hungry for, which I would definitely encourage you to go and seek out. Where can you find these things? Social media, like little community groups, pages. If you hear about a local protest going on, just get out there, talk to your neighbors, talk to your family members, talk to students at the local college. What are they worried about? But the way to make this local news relevant, I would say, is always to connect it to the wider conversation. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. Say you hear about farmers in your district who are unable to grow a certain crop because the rainfall has been really less this year, or we recently had locust attacks in North India. The story is not about that farmer in your district and how he's struggling to grow that crop. He is the entryway for you to discuss the fragility potentially of the Indian food system, or even the global food system. It's your entry point to educate other people on this particular issue. So that is how you also get the interest of editors. That is how you kind of zoom out. One tip an editor gave me very early on, which I always thank him for and find very helpful, is to not ignore local newspapers, regional language newspapers, because there you have local reporters who are uncovering this news firsthand, and you can go and follow up on these issues because they usually lack the resources to do that themselves, and turn that into a global story even, or even a national story at least. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I definitely think now is a good time to pursue these local news stories, especially when a lot of us are probably away from metro centers. Another place to look for stories is, of course, investigating people, projects, companies. And I call this following the pollution and following the money. So it's about looking at a supply chain or looking at a group of companies and really digging out what is happening behind that. This obviously requires a lot of research, a lot of resources, and a lot of time, which is why I think now during the pandemic, when a lot of our travel restrictions are in place, many of us are at home, it's a great time to just start digging into a topic and getting your papers in order so that when we are able to travel a little bit, you're ready to go and pursue that investigation. Environmental journalism, because of the nature of the beat, the environment is intensely political, it's intensely related to the economy, to social justice, to our health. It's actually ripe for investigations. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you look at fossil fuel emissions, that it affects our health, it affects the way the global economy runs, it affects so many different overlapping issues that you're never going to be stuck for ideas. But yeah, it also means it's hard to know where to begin. So some questions to start with. I'd say if you are looking into some companies, you might want to see if they're employing other organizations to lobby for them. If they are, what kind of things are they lobbying for? Has their lobbying been successful, and has regulation changed because of their lobbying? That's interesting because then you're seeing private money being used for potentially nefarious ends. So that's always a really interesting line of investigation. It's also interesting to find out if the owners of these organizations are friendly with any politicians, if they've made any donations, and after that, has any law actually changed? I think obviously this is very difficult to do and comes with its own risks, which I'll discuss later on in the session. But this is the kind of journalism which really makes an impact. And if you have a little bit of expertise in this area to begin with, you can really, really go far. Another thing I like to do is also take one product which is potentially being sold on the market and then break that product down into all its components and see, where is this component being made? How is it being transported? What is the environment like where it's being made? And really examine all those elements. And then you can potentially see, again, following the pollution and following the money, what's going on there. The EIA draft 2020, this is probably the most important thing which is happening to India in the environment space right now, and is really requires some digging into. There is an incredible guy, Nitin Sethi, who is an incredible independent journalist who does this a lot. He tweets out his findings a lot as well. But all these changes in law and regulation, they're such dense materials, which the language itself hides so many things. If you have the time now to look through this, maybe call up some experts that you're in touch with, some professors, this is where you can get ideas. And then later on, you can go out onto the ground and see who this is affecting. Every change in law and regulation, people will benefit and people will lose out. So your job is to see who is being affected and who is gaining here. If you've been reading about it, you might see that the Environment Ministry is reluctant to translate the EIA into certain regional languages. So then you can follow up and see, well, which people will miss out on not having this important legislation translated into their language, and how will that play out on the ground? I mean, these are very basic ideas that I'm talking about here, but you can see the process if you just need to spend some time reading, spend some time researching, and then going out on the ground. That's always how it works out. And also, pandemics are convenient times for people to push through legislation like this, which is why I say now is a good time to start investigations, because as we've seen with other things, changes to high school textbooks, things like this, pandemics are quite helpful for certain governments and certain regimes. So now is a good time, I think, to start looking into this. And then I've just listed here the GIJN, which is an incredible resource for reporters. If you go there, you'll find many examples of investigations around the world, and reporters talk about how they did it, so you could get some good inspiration there. And then I would also recommend subscribing to According to Documents, which is a newsletter compiled by 2 Reuters journalists. And they pick investigations each week, compile that in a newsletter and send it out. And there are investigations around the world, but they really look at how reporters have been drilling into documents and exposing ways policies and laws are being changed around the world. That's definitely something worth checking out. So in the reading list that was circulated to you before the session, you'll find links to these 2 articles. One is Empire Oil, and the other is Waste Only. And I really like these 2 investigations because I think they could be replicated within the Indian context. So Empire Oil, London's dirty secret, basically what the journalists did here is they looked at one company in particular, which is listed on the alternative investments market in London, which is a kind of alternative stock exchange, is known to kind of host cowboys, basically. It's kind of, there's not a lot of compliance that goes on there with companies that are listing. And they found out that although the British government talks a heavy hand on disinvesting from fossil fuel companies, they're allowing, like in this case, it was a Nigerian oil company to list on the London Stock Exchange. And then they followed the line and saw all along the way, kind of what was going on there. So that's really worth looking into. And then the same with Waste Only, is about the plastic industry. This was a great example of greenwashing. So how plastics companies in the US have been using lobbyists to kind of make sure that policy doesn't affect them too much. But then publicly they're saying that they're making a lot of concessions to improving their footprint. So again, I think that would be really interesting for the Indian context, because we have a lot of corporates here who have incredible marketing campaigns saying they're doing this, that, and the other, but actually what are they doing behind the scenes? So that's another really great example worth reading. Seeking out overlaps. This is another great way to find story ideas. And that, like I mentioned in the previous slide, is because environmental journalism overlaps in so many different areas. It's not just science journalism, but it's also looking at how climate change and pollution affects our health, affects access to justice, affects the economy. And sometimes when outlets don't have environment editors, you may find yourself pitching to a health editor a story about how climate change is affecting maternal health, for example. And another reason why I think overlapping stories are great is because, a lot of time editors don't necessarily always want to go for a climate change story or a pollution story, because they feel like they had one earlier in the week, they had one last week, might be a little fatigue around that topic. But if you can provide an overlapping story, then that just, it expands your audience, and it doesn't limit your story to only a purely science story, environment story, climate change story. So I like these overlapping type stories quite a lot, and I have 2 examples here. If I just start with this one in the bottom right corner, this was a really nice story for India Spend about how climate change is leading a lot of people in West Bengal to migrate because their farms are becoming unviable. But it looked at migration because of climate change through an education lens. So what happens to these families when they arrive in new cities, they don't speak the language, and the children are thrust into primary school education. So this story looked at climate change migration, but actually through the eyes of a primary school teacher and the children. So I thought that was really interesting because, again, it's a story that shows an overlap: climate change, education, migration, 3 overlaps actually. And it's another great entry point into the issue. And then Cancer Town, The Guardian. So this was a really, really nice series that The Guardian ran, I think, in 2018, which drilled down into this town in Louisiana, in the south of America, which is one of the most polluted towns in the whole of the US because the population there are living next to a chemicals factory. And it wasn't just a standard pollution story. It actually drilled into areas of racial justice and how, because a lot of the community people that are affected are African American, it showed how the health system and access to social benefits, a lot of it is the marginalized people are affected the most. And unfortunately, with climate change and environment stories, the poor always lose out and are always the most affected. So again, that was a really nice story, which wasn't just a pure pollution, pure environment story. It's definitely worth reading that. And I think this story also has some really cool tech elements as well in the way it was laid out. So just really nice read. Okay, digging through data. So this is my favorite way to find stories, actually. I think this comes from my beginning at India Spend. I was kind of always just given a lot of reports and research to read through. And there's a lot of stories that you can find here just by, as you're reading, noting down any statistic, any fact, or any finding that really stands out to you. Because if you find something interesting and if you think that you haven't heard this incredible data point before, then that kind of means you're onto something. So if it's striking to you, it's worth following up upon. And as I said, every good story is grounded in research, but then you need to go out onto the ground and see how it's affecting real people. So here are some places I've listed out to look. All these organizations produce a lot of research all the time. Their own employees and staff are really integrated with the research community, so they can also lead you to new papers. But just be a little bit careful when you're writing on new research, because you have to do your own due diligence and just make sure that the research you're writing on has been peer reviewed, and you're not kind of stepping on anyone's toes by saying that this is a great finding when it hasn't actually been thoroughly checked. What do I mean by this? Actually, I'll just give you a little bit of an example. Say, for example, you're reading an academic paper which predicts, Gujarat to be the most affected state in 2030 by extreme temperature rise. That might be an interesting finding for you. So you would note that down. Then you would say to your editor, hey, I think I should go to Gujarat. I should find out how people are preparing for this, to see if there are any people who are already suffering from extreme temperature rise, how are they going to cope in the next 10 years? And then when you get to the ground and you do your reporting, you might actually find a new angle to the story. You may find, for example, that, the state government actually has a scheme for people to, update their homes and make them more cooling. So there's a good story. That's a good governance story. And then you can find out if it's working or not. If it's not working, maybe some communities, potentially some lower caste communities, are not accessing these funds. And there's another story. It's a social justice story. It's a discrimination story. So that is what I mean by digging through data, by finding interesting and striking data points and then following up on it. A good example of this is from the New York Times. So this is a story about how climate change is leading to extreme flooding in some parts of India, but extreme drought in others. And if you read this story, you'll find that it's really heavily grounded in research and data, but it brings the data to life So the data is all in the second or third paragraph, but the ground reporting is the main focus, and the science is really, really clearly explained. And then the story pushes the conversation forward. So it's not just merely reporting, oh, the UN predicts XYZ. It also goes onto the ground and sees, the real life of people. So I really like this, and I thought because it added a policy element to it, it was a really well-rounded article. So definitely worth checking that out. Okay, now solutions journalism. I don't know if many of you will have heard of this term. I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, it's a movement in the last few years, which is to address the fact that a lot of people are basically getting tired of bad news, and it can lead to a lot of fatigue as well. We don't want to always read about the problems related to climate change. We also want to know, what is being done to address it. So there's this nice quote that I've added here, because the problems scream, but the solutions whisper. We often overlook them. So this is not to say that we shouldn't discuss the bad effects of climate change or pollution or the environment. It's more that we don't always have to focus on the impact, but we can also focus on how people are, trying to work on them and address these issues. So one way to find out what people are doing is to actually revisit your own work and revisit what you've previously written on. So I, for example, last year might have written a story about farms in Bangladesh on the coast who are, the salt water is coming into their farms and the soil is getting too salty for them to grow certain crops. So instead of just keeping on writing about that and how terrible it is for the farmers, you might want to talk to some scientists in the local area who have come up with a way for farmers to grow different types of crops or reduce the salinity in the soil. That's just one example, but it's a way that you can kind of work backwards and add to the conversation. So you can do that with your own work. You can do that with other people's work. A lot of times reporters don't follow up on stories that they've written a year ago because they get moved on to other things. So that's a good place to look for solutions journalism stories. Another thing you can do is turning the issue inside out. So again, you may come across stories which are just, again, very alarmist. This is terrible. This is going to lead to X million deaths. This is going to lead to huge displacement of people. All these kind of horrible issues related to the environment. But you can, again, turn them inside out. Instead of thinking, oh, I should write on this terrible impact, take a step back and think, oh, actually, what is being done to address this? And I find editors more keen to write about these kinds of stories now, because there's only so much doom and gloom we can all handle. So that's a good avenue to go down. Just one warning at the end, when you're looking for solutions journalism stories, you may be kind of, wanting to find hope in any area. So you may find yourself looking at companies developing all these new kinds of products and engineering solutions, but you just have to be a little bit wary of their own PR talk and their own promotion around it. You still need to do, your reporting around the subject. You still need to get other people's opinions and perspectives and views on the solution, not just purely write about the solution itself. So just something to bear in mind. You just need to remain analytical. And again, there's are a couple of examples here of two solution stories that I really liked. The one by Soumya Sarkar, for example, this was nice because it gives you the solution up front, how solar irrigation is helping farmers to stay in their hometowns. But at the same time, it gives you a good overview of the problem as well. So solutions journalism is not to ignore issues and to ignore the bad news, but it's to kind of frame the bad news differently. You kind of start with good news, as it will. And a lot of people are actually using that to cover politics, cover the pandemic. And it's a way to make sure that your audience stays engaged and you don't turn people off, basically. It's a solution to that. Okay, so just moving on to the next section now, creating a compelling narrative. So you've found your story idea, you know what you want to write on, how can we make that story better? So first and foremost, I would always suggest starting with the people that are affected the most. This is something that my editor always used to tell me. He was like, people are only going to relate to, issues like glaciers melting, sea levels rising, these vast concepts, which, are pretty weighty, if they can enter the issue through a person, through a place that they know, that they can imagine, through an anecdote that they can relate with. So that's why people are just so important. There's a picture here that I've added from, I think it was last September, when I was in Singrauli in Madhya Pradesh, which is the coal mining heartlands, really. And yeah, I think immediately when you see this picture, or if you read about this man, you can then place his problems and the problems related to India building more and more coal power plants and mining more of its coal and destroying more of its forests way more easily than if I just gave you a bunch of facts and figures. So yeah, it sounds very simple and very basic, and actually this is important for all types of journalism, I think. There's always just to have a person at the center of it, but yeah, it's very important. And even if you think, I'm stuck in my house, how can I go now and talk to people on the ground? How can I do this? Even if you're writing a story that you've done all the reporting purely from your own house, you still will have found out a lot about the person affected. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was talking to a lot of migrant laborers, actually, unfortunately, who were still stuck in their place of work and hadn't been able to get home. And I did it all via phone call. I couldn't obviously go and meet any of them. This was during lockdown. But I still managed to find out a lot about them and about their lives. So I always started my stories with a little paragraph about them, because that's how your reader can relate and can enter the story. So just something to bear in mind. And then secondly, and I think this is, again, so important and sounds so basic, but everything you write needs to be understood by your reader. And I think I definitely didn't really get this very early on in my career, because I was always so time pressured to write stories and just, get things done. But if you take just 5 minutes to read over your copy and see, have I actually explained from the beginning? Say I'm writing an article about the Forest Rights Act. Have I actually taken the time to explain what that is in 2 sentences or less? And have I used language which my mother would understand, which the person down the street will understand? Or am I using language that only the scientists that I've interviewed, the NGOs that I've spoken to will understand? Because that is the real purpose of journalism, right? You need to inform and you need to educate people. I've written here brackets the auntie test, because this is something me and my colleague would do all the time for our Environment Undone project, which is I wouldn't tell my mom, my neighbor, my auntie, anything about what I was writing. And I would just say, hey, can you read this paragraph and do you understand what's going on? And if they couldn't, I knew I'd failed and I'd have to go back and redo it, because that's the thing about the environment. It's science journalism at the end of the day. But if you can't communicate these concepts to anyone, you're talking to yourself. And at the end of the day, you're wasting your own hard work. So I like to use the auntie test. And if you're wondering, how do I break down these complex concepts? How do I talk about melting glaciers in a simple way? I have to use scientific language. There are a lot of resources and training materials out there already. I've named a few places here on the slide: Earth Journalism, SEJ, and they have a lot of tip sheets and a lot of resources which kind of break it down for you. So it's good. You can see if your copy is mirroring theirs. Again, it's like I've already mentioned, this is really important for environmental journalism, because this it's important stuff, and we're passionate about it, and we want people to engage with it and to also become passionate about it. But if you don't soften your own language and you don't let them enter the concept and break down the concept, then it's not going to work. These 2 points here about narrating climate change, Columbia Journalism Review, and Yale Climate Connections. These are 2 places you can go to see how people are working on communicating about the environment and science better. So both of these websites will have lists of environment journalism examples, which they think communicate concepts really well. And I've just added a quote down here from George Orwell. So he wrote this fantastic essay about communicating in the English language, and obviously it's appropriate for all languages, which is about, again, how if you try to show off with your language, if you try to show people, oh, see, I'm amazing, I've understood this concept really well, and then you use flowery language, you use just complicated language, you're doing everyone a disservice. And writing simply, clearly, with the least words possible is actually the way forward. And in the reading materials, I think I left a link to his essay where he discussed this. Basically, use as few words as possible and the simplest words as possible, and then you're on to a winner. This is one of my favorite pieces of science journalism and probably just writing of all time. It's such a cool article in the first instance because it's about this quite scary event which could happen at any time, which is an earthquake on the Pacific coast of the US, which is just going to be a seismic event and going to disrupt actually like the Earth's climate, and it's a hugely populated area of the world. So it's about something really weighty, really heavy, really intense. It's about seismology and tectonics, but the way that Catherine Schultz, the author here, has written it, she makes it so simple to understand. The article will easily be enjoyed by seismology experts, by other journalists, by just anybody. And for me, that's the ultimate goal in journalism, is to write clearly, to write beautifully, to write engagingly. So I would really, really have a read of that one. There are some digital tools which you can use to kind of bring your stories to life. Where a lot of journalism now, because it's online, because it's on our mobiles, everyone wants it to be interactive, and like people like the New York Times, The Economist, they all do this really well, but obviously they have big budgets. And it's just not in reach for all of us. But there are some free tools available online. So I would suggest checking out Tableau Public, for example, if you wanted to create charts, graphs for your stories. There are a lot of free infographic and GIF creators as well online. I wanted to mention Night Lab, which is a really cool website, which I think is by the Knight Center for Journalism. And they have developed these tools, which I've just listed here: Scene VR, Story Map, and Juxtapose. There's a picture of Scene VR at the bottom. This is where, I don't know if only iPhones do this or if other phones do it too, where when you take panoramic photos, Scene VR will stitch the panoramic photos together, and then they can create a 360 viewing experience. And then you can embed that in your story itself. And I'm pretty sure it's either free or like a very nominal fee that you'd have to pay. But if you do a little bit of digging, things like this could really bring your stories to life. I mean, the example below, you can see it's like an area that's been destroyed by a hurricane. So just imagine doing that in the Indian context. It would be a really great way to engage readers. I've mentioned fact checking here because I think obviously with like a lot of areas in journalism, the environment, there's a lot of misinformation around climate change especially. And Google reverse image search is a tool that a lot of fact checkers use when you have images circulating on WhatsApp or other fake news. You can just put a photo into the reverse image search and it can tell you if the photo is what it says it is. Most likely it's probably an image that was used years ago for another purpose and someone is trying to claim it as something else. Yeah, so I thought that could be interesting in an environment context. If you have, climate change denial or something like that, you could fact check things quite easily. This is just something which I wanted everyone to be aware of, which is in the kind of urge to make your stories compelling and engaging and beautifully written, you shouldn't forget about the science. The science should always be at the heart of your stories. And this is something which was definitely hammered home to us when we were writing our Environment Undone series, which is that, you'll come across a lot of activists, campaign groups, people with a lot of passion, but they are not the story. The story is always the science and the people that are affected on the ground. So, as a journalist, you have to explore all avenues and all points of views. You shouldn't be, led astray by one of those. I'm not saying don't talk to activists, don't talk to campaign groups. They are incredibly helpful. I couldn't have done some of my stories without them. Greenpeace, for example, they were with me many times on the ground, helping me meet people that have been affected by disasters or people who live in heavily polluted areas. But what I'm saying is that those groups are never the story themselves. So just remain fact-based and data-driven, and make sure that you have a good understanding of the concept you're talking about itself. So scientific literacy is important because that means you can't be led astray by other people's interpretations of it, for example. When I did a story on the Ken Betwa Link project, which will affect the Panna Tiger Reserve, I had a lot of people who obviously were extremely invested in the Tiger Reserve, and they lived in the area, and they were campaigning a lot and doing a lot of good work for it, but their science wasn't always 100%. So you just have to double check and fact check everything that you're told, basically, and remain rooted in the science. Reporting challenges. So I'll just quickly go over some of the things which I think you may come across, some of the hurdles. So you may have chosen that you want to investigate a certain topic, but some of the data which you think is crucial to your investigation may be behind certain barriers or potentially might not even exist. A lot of governments say that their data is open source, but actually when you begin looking into it, you will find that it's not, or you'll just be heavily delayed. So, for example, you may be able to file an RTI request, but after 30 days, it'll come back and there'll be some made up answer of why they're not able to share the data with you, something like that. So you just have to be aware of those hurdles. It may mean you end up scraping, sourcing, and cleaning a lot of data yourself. So for Environment Undone, we had to do that. We'd never thought we'd have to hire a data scientist, but we did. And there's a lot of information that we needed on the Environment Ministry's website, which we couldn't have found without a data scientist creating a code and scraping the data for us. There are other ways to request data if you find that your requests are going unheard. And one is to form a group. So I really like this example by the Thai Society of Environment Journalists. Basically, there were a couple of journalists who had independently sent questions to the Thai government asking about a particular, I think it was a palm oil factory that they were investigating. Their requests went unheard, no one got back to them. But once they formed a group of about 20 journalists, all wanting the answers to the same questions, they suddenly had a bigger presence, had a bigger force, could create a bigger noise, and eventually the government could not respond to them. I really like the way, for example, with the EIA draft, everybody emailing in to the Environment Ministry has now meant that they've had to respond and say that, yeah, we're going to extend the deadline, all that kind of thing. So it really shows you that grouping together and power in numbers can get you places. So when the data doesn't actually exist, there are ways you can create the data yourself. I call this closing the gap. A really interesting project that did this, which was actually by India Spend, it's called #Breathe. They did it before I joined, actually, I think in about 2015. They wanted to look at air quality across India, not just in Delhi, which they knew obviously is one of the most polluted places in the world, but they wanted a pan-India view of air quality. So they tied up with an organization which was building sensors for quite a low cost. And I'm not sure the ins and outs of if India Spend had to, put in some funds into this, but basically through the tie-up, they were able to send these low-cost sensors around the country and build a network themselves and gather data on air quality themselves. And the sensors were active, I think, for at least a year. So they built their own data set on air quality throughout a whole year around India. And yeah, that's something that they couldn't have got access to that data or found that data anywhere else. So that was a huge investment of time and resource, but at the end of it, they were left with a very rich data set. And then finally, collaborating. That's another great way to access data. If you're not able to do this yourself, there probably will be other organizations who are also interested in this, also want to do this. And just putting a simple call out on Twitter or messaging around a few universities, you may find some other researchers who are also interested in this, and then you can join together and think about how to do it. And then you probably will have to accredit the people that you collaborate with in your report. We did this for Environment and Done. We needed some satellite imagery, which we weren't able to get hold of through any other means, through any publicly available means. So we collaborated with the World Resources Institute to get that. And we just added an accreditation line, which they were happy with. Some people will want to be paid, but you just have to kind of negotiate that on your own terms. Yeah. All right, funding, travel, and ambitious projects. So this is probably one of the biggest hurdles you will come across is you want to travel to this incredibly important, incredibly remote place, but how will you get there? How will you afford it? Luckily, there are plenty of organizations who will want to help you do this. As was mentioned earlier in the session, I myself was the recipient of a grant from the Pulitzer Center. So they constantly offer grants and fellowships to fund journalists doing ambitious projects. The grants are usually very specific. So you just need to read what each particular grant is asking for and really, really read it carefully, because I've spoken to a few people who sit on these juries, and you would be surprised how many times people apply for certain grants and their story idea just isn't relevant, and then you've wasted your own time, you've wasted the jury's time. So just read the information in the grant calls very carefully. So yes, it's not just Pulitzer Center that do this, but also Earth Journalism Network constantly offer grants and fellowships, and then a couple other places I've written there as well. You will need to be specific when you apply for your grant, and by that I mean it's okay to not know what your story is totally, but you should have a well-researched application, so you know what you're going to investigate, you know where you're going to travel, you know who you're going to talk to, and you know roughly how long you're going to spend on the project. And then you also need to put together a reasonable budget. And I say reasonable because the people on these committees, they are experienced journalists. They've done reporting trips many times themselves. They know how much things cost. So if you, inflate the cost a little bit, or if you add a stipend for yourself when it says in the grant call that stipends for journalists are not included, then that kind of does go against you. So, and also if you put together a reasonable budget, people will have confidence that you know what you're doing. If any of you have any questions about what a reasonable budget is, please feel free to reach out for me anytime. And then you also need to explain why you're the right person for the job. So yeah, if you've written on the topic many times before, you can obviously send in a CV with links to previous writing examples. But if you haven't written on, or if you haven't written anything before, if you don't have any clips to send in, do not worry. You can explain why you know the topic that you want to research more well, your previous experience in the sector. Basically, you just need to show them that you haven't just woken up one day and decided that you want to do reporting on this random topic, but you do know something about it. Yeah, and then make it shine. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were like, you know what? I read so many applications, and you'd be surprised that many of them are really boring, which she finds surprising because, as a journalist, you're meant to write engaging copy, you're meant to be able to write well, and your application really is the first time you're showing a jury the type of work you can produce. So you should think about writing the application as if you were writing a story, or writing the first few paragraphs of your story. What's the hook? What's the interesting factor? Add some, data points and some research which back up why you want to investigate this project, do this project. So yeah, it can be difficult when you only find out about a grant 2 weeks before the deadline or a week before or whatever. But if you can spend a lot of time working on that first application, then at least you have a template for future grant proposals, and then you don't have to spend as much time again in the future. But definitely worth going over it, definitely worth showing it to people who can give you comments. I'd be happy to talk to any of you about any grant applications. But yeah, that's really a good way to fund your travel and fund any ambitious projects that you may have thought of. And then just finally, I wanted to talk about this. This is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for environment journalists in India, and that's staying safe. India is one of the most dangerous countries for environment reporters. You're, at the end of the day, you're exposing people with influential links to politicians, people handling a large amount of money, people handling a large amount of land. You may become a target. I think actually, like as I've written here, location is more of a risk than the topic. So I would never not write about something because I'm scared about writing about it. It's more about traveling on your own. So illegal sand mining, for example, unfortunately, I think a couple of journalists have died, have been killed for writing about that. But I don't think anyone would be in harm's way writing about illegal sand mining from their homes in the city. It's just about choosing your locations carefully and how you're going to go there. When you have an editor on board for an investigation, for a story, they should talk to you about how you're going to stay safe. They should be in contact with you all the time. And you should feel comfortable that you're happy to do this story with them. I would never do a story for an editor who I feel doesn't have my back. And that actually isn't always about physical safety, but also about future safety in terms of your reputation. If a story you did ever attracted, a legal case, you would still want that organization and that editor to be behind you all the way. So definitely keep that in mind. But yeah, ultimately you're on your own in terms of being on the field. If your editor is in Mumbai and you're in, I don't know, Northern Bihar, you have to look out for your own safety, and you have to do as much research before you go there as possible. I was definitely very naive when I traveled to Singrauli, to the coal mining areas. I just kind of showed up there as a girl, and I had hired a local translator who was also a woman, and she was really, really, really nice. And she actually suggested, I think my husband's going to stay with us for the week while we're here. Like I think it'll just be safer. And I hate to admit it, but as a woman on the ground, it helps to have a man around sometimes, because just they just kind of look a bit more, they blend into the background a lot more. We definitely stood out. Okay. Safety and numbers. If it's not possible for you to always hire translators, hire photographers, and kind of create your own convoy when you're traveling, it may be worth reaching out to other journalists that you know, who may be interested in traveling to the same area with you. So you might not be doing the same story. You might be doing an environment story. They might be doing a health story, but you can travel together. And again, you have safety in numbers that way. Or there are specialist networks that you can visit. So Earth Journalism Network, for example, they actually have a section of their website where you can say, hi, I'm Tish and I want to travel to Assam next week. Is anyone else interested in traveling with me? And people from, well, this is obviously before COVID-19, but people would respond and say, yeah, I'm in Germany, yeah, I'm in the US, I'm coming, can we plan our trip together? So it's just another way of not traveling alone, basically. And then I think I have time just to finish off with a case study. So I mentioned at the beginning that I just wrapped up this 1-year-long investigation project called Environment Undone. So this is something that I did with a colleague of mine from India Spend. We were interested in this idea that India's Environment Ministry doesn't always have the environment kind of front in mind. So we'd read a report, I think, by the Center for Science and Environment, which it was incredible. They had looked at the rate of clearances. There's a speed at which clearances were being given, and the report showed that they were just getting faster and faster, which meant that more land was being opened to infrastructure projects. So we wanted to investigate that topic in particular, and also whether, the fact that India's government is openly pursuing a $5 trillion economy by 2024, that the Environment Ministry has said we want to improve the ease of doing business within our ministry. We wanted to see if that meant India's last pockets of biodiversity protected areas were coming under strain. So we, and I should mention, for this grant that we had from the Pulitzer Center, there was a data visualization aspect to it, which is why we created this interactive map. So we scraped the Parivesh portal dashboard for all the location coordinates of every single project that had been granted environment clearance since 2014, and we plotted them on a map. And then we also overlaid that map with the boundaries of each protected area. So we were able to find out which projects had been granted clearance within protected areas and also near to protected areas. So that's what this map is showing. The darker regions are nearer to protected areas and the lighter regions are outside of protected areas. So that was the basis of our story. We then picked certain projects which were located either inside protected areas or directly affected protected areas. And we wanted to combine this with ground reporting. So we wanted to show that these projects, which had been approved, were poorly conceived, as in they were environmentally damaging, they were going to cost astronomical amounts, and they were not going to deliver the outcomes promised. And we also wanted to show that the way that these projects were granted clearances meant that certain legal safeguards had been ignored. And then our ground reporting was also able to show that how the local communities in each case were affected, and also how wildlife, often protected species, their welfare was being ignored. So you can see there we traveled to, Disha, my colleague, traveled to Karwar, which is in Karnataka, and she also traveled to the Western Ghats. I traveled to Bundelkhand and also Singrauli for this project. And we definitely wouldn't have been able to do this without the grant. One thing I should mention about applying for grants and funding your travel through grants is that many grants will still require you to be paid by the outlet by the publication for the articles that you have published. So they are not meant to replace a journalist's salary. Like you're not meant to work for free, but the grants are meant to help you travel and push your reporting further, basically. So some challenges and lessons that I learned from doing this project. The news changes. So what I mean by that is on the right, you can see the first article in our series. So as well as the foreground reports that I showed you on the previous slide, we also had an introduction story, which was kind of a pure data story. We just wanted to discuss all the data we discovered. But you can see in the article headline, we had to tag this onto the news cycle, which in March had become obviously all about COVID-19 and the pandemic, which is not something which we had planned for. We didn't plan to do a pandemic related story, but it actually worked out really nicely. And it was something that our editor requested. She wanted the project not to be delayed in its publication, but we had to connect it to the current news cycle. So yeah, that's something that you should just be aware of, that if you're working on a project for, a few months, a year, that things might move pretty fast. Things might change by the time you're ready to release it publicly. Editors can change. This is something that happened to us. My editor at India Spend, he had left for various reasons, and he was the editor that was there at the inception of the project. And then we I was still freelance at this point. I didn't really touch base with him while I was doing the project, but then towards the end, I had a different point of contact at India Spend. And that person then had to get up to speed with the project, wrap their head around it. And, it was quite a complex project, that, 5 articles and interactive maps. So that was a little bit of a challenge, because she also had her own ideas of what the project should look like at the end. So there was a little bit of a tussle there. I mean, it wasn't a problem, but it was just, again, another mini hurdle, I would say, that we had to get across. I mentioned traveling as a woman, so I won't repeat that, but yeah, I just was very naive about it. I didn't think I would really be in that much danger, but maybe I think that's when your passion overrides your kind of sensible approach to things. I was just keen to get out there as soon as possible. But looking back on it, it was good that I had at least a couple of phone numbers in each location that I was, of people local activists, people that Greenpeace and other NGOs had put me in touch with, so that if I ever was in need of some help, at least I had 2 or 3 phone numbers of people living in the area that I could contact. So yeah, unfortunately, I mean, it's not just traveling as a woman. If I would recommend to anybody before they travel to an area, just make sure that you have some backup, or some plan of what you would do if you get into trouble. And I don't just mean threats because you're reporting on a sensitive topic, but if the weather changes and you get stuck in a certain area. I mean, I was traveling during some pretty heavy rains at one point, and we got delayed for that. So yeah, always good to give yourself extra time and have a backup. And then I've put here budgeting for video and greater tech support. So I think now that I have applied successfully for one grant, and I know that they didn't really question how much we asked for, I definitely would, in my next application, just push the boundaries a little bit further and include budget for a videographer. I think that really would have pushed the series to the next level. We took all the photos ourselves, and whereas I've had a little bit of photography training, I would say, half an hour of how to get the best photos possible from your iPhone, because we went to some really, really remote and cool places. If we could have afforded a videographer to create some excellent video, that would have been amazing. And also greater tech support. So we were lucky to hire I say hire a data scientist. We found a data scientist through my friend Disha, someone she went to university with, who did it pro bono for us, kind of outside of her office hours, because that was really all we could afford. We just paid her a nominal amount. But next time I would definitely build in a section for tech support into the budget and make sure that we can really do everything we wanted to do. The map took way longer than we expected, which I guess is common for all projects, because you just find more hurdles along the way as you go. For example, some of the coordinates we found for projects were outside of India even. We plotted them, they'd be in North America or the Middle East, and it would have been really nice to actually drill down into those projects and be like, how has this happened? But just wasn't possible with the time and with the resources available. That is the end of my session. I'm hope you found that useful. And if any of you have any questions for me about anything I've talked about, or about, like I said at the beginning, working as a freelance journalist and pitching as well, I'm very, very happy to answer those questions.
Thank you so much, Tish. That was really, really insightful. I'm sure that was helpful. I mean, we've got a lot of questions already.
Okay, great.
So we'll start with Anjali. If you could just unmute yourself and ask Tish.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for this. It was really helpful. So my main question was about when, let's say, as a third party, so I'm not affiliated with any particular publication, or if I'm just submitting a story to a journalist who's then picking up that story, what kind of stories usually get picked up? So if it's a very how much does lobbying actually influence which kind of stories journalists pick up and which kind of stories are run? So if I'm an individual submitting a story about the environment, they tend to also go very anti-lobbies and things like that. So how does that get balanced in the paper, and how much of which paper is done is actually decided by the editor? What exactly is the process to understand that? And is there a way we should, as a third party who's writing an article, should we frame it in a particular way so that it possibly doesn't touch certain lobbies, or doesn't, for it to be done more easily?
So sorry, when you say third party, do you mean you work for like a charity? Or
so like I'm a student, and if I'm working with an environmental organization and we've been doing some on-ground work and we find a story, so let's say I write a press release and I send it to a journalist.
Okay, so it depends. I think if you're wanting to write the story yourself, obviously don't send a press release, and pitch the story as if you're the author of the story. So in a pitch, you always want to say why the story is interesting. So first check if the story has been written by the publication that you're writing to. Even if it was written last year or the year before, the publication might be sensitive about it. See if any other publication has written about it at all in the past 1 year. Once you've done that, you know if your story is new and interesting. And then, secondly, make it clear whether you're writing the story as yourself, like with your name on it, Anjali, or if you're writing the story as an organization. Because if you aren't writing the story yourself and you want the journalist at the publication to write the story, then you will send a press release, you'll give them the information. But if you're writing the story yourself, you will have full control of it. And so it's a bit of a different issue. If you're working for an organization and you want to be the author of the piece, that's totally fine, but you'll probably have to just mention at the bottom, asterisk, with an asterisk, I'm Anjali Dalmia and I work for this organization, just to have full transparency of why you're writing the piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Is that okay?
Sure, please make it a little quick because there are a lot of
really quick.
questions.
I think my question is also partly about how, if a story is being pitched, are there certain, like how much is lobbying in terms of the industries that we have, especially in environmental journalism, play into which story is run or not run?
I don't think it plays a huge role. I think let's connect after the session and I can just understand your question a little bit better. But I'll follow up with you later.
Great. Thanks, Anjali. The next question is from Seema.
I'll just be asking from Seema's behalf because her audio isn't working. Tish, she wanted to know, when you go to rural areas, how often do you rely on translators? And have you ever been concerned with miscommunication?
I don't always rely on translators. Obviously, it depends on your own language skills. So for me personally, like I didn't speak Bhojpuri, and I knew that was essential to really engaging with some of the people that I went to visit in UP. I think the key is to know that your translator, like check their command of the language first. So I actually found my translator in a very interesting way. She was a local journalist, so I reached out to her and I said, would you be interested in helping me? And so because we spoke a few times and she helped me plan my trip, I knew that her Hindi and her English was really good. Obviously, I always record every conversation so that I can replay it back to myself multiple times. So if I did miss anything when I'm on the ground or my notes are a little bit illegible, I always have the recording to go over. And my translator is also very helpful that I could just call her up and run things past her. So yeah, always keep a recording, always make extensive notes, and always verify that you're comfortable with your translator before you go on the trip.
Yeah, Vaishnavi, is that okay? Can we move on?
Yeah, I think so. In case she has another question, but we'll take that up later towards the
Okay,
end.
all right. Next, Seher, if you can please unmute yourself. Seher, are you on? Okay, I think let's just move on and then we'll come back to Seher later. Next, we have Soumitra. Soumitra, I know you have 3 questions, but if you could possibly mix them into one or ask your most important one, that'll be good.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, Tish. Thanks a lot.
Hi.
So I wanted to know, is Instagram an effective tool to talk about environment, and how does the writing differ there?
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Is what an effective tool?
Is Instagram an effective tool to talk about environment and
yeah,
writing?
definitely. So obviously Instagram is a very visual tool. So if you have incredible pictures, it's a great place to showcase it. And you'll notice that a lot of publications obviously have Instagram profiles. So people are using Instagram stories and now Reels as well as a great way to get your story across. I personally wouldn't just use Instagram as a place for my stories because, well, I mean, I'm coming at it from a writing perspective, and I don't think I would, be able to get everything I want across on an Instagram post. But definitely a great way to expand the reach of your stories. Everything that is published, I do put on Instagram, although I need to definitely create a professional Instagram handle to differentiate from my personal posts and professional ones. But yeah, I wouldn't use it as a tool exclusively, but definitely as an aid.
Okay, got it. Cool. Thank you.
Soumitra, you can ask one of your other 2 questions. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So other question was how to write about a topic that is published already while using paraphrasing.
While using paraphrasing. Sorry, what do you mean by that?
So I had written a topic earlier, which the editor had asked me to do paraphrasing of an already published article. So, I found it difficult to do that. So how do I approach this particular thing?
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean that the editor wanted you to just include some of the information from a previous article in your new article?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So if something new has happened since you wrote that previous article, you may want to use the previous article as context for what has happened. Let me try and think of an example. Say you're covering a new coal plant or something that's being built. Actually, no, that's not a good example. Yeah, basically, I think what your editor is asking you to do is to not disregard what has been written on the subject previously, but to include that as extra material and helpful reference in your new article, so that your new article has some history, has some context around it. Okay. He probably doesn't want you to copy paste, I'm pretty sure, but just to pull information and data from there.
Okay, all right, got it.
Okay, we have Amulya next. Amulya, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Tish. Thank you so much for the talk. Hi. So one of my personal observations has been in India, especially all the environmental journalism stories that are being broken, they are from independent journalists. So do you think that, to practice meaningful environment journalism, someone like me who's currently working in a legacy newspaper has to move into independent journalism to pursue the stories that I want to pursue? I mean, right now I'm being encouraged to, pursue good stories. It's not that, but it's with very tight deadlines. Each week I need to do something. So I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is obviously the biggest problem affecting the quality of environmental coverage right now is exactly what you just mentioned is, being time pressured because you need to deliver potentially a certain number of other stories while having to work on a long-term project. Obviously, the advantage of being an independent journalist is that you have control over your own time and what to pursue, but it's all a balance, really. I mean, I actually would love a staff job sometimes because that gives you other opportunities, right? It gives you it gives you a grounding in a way. I think what you need to do is have a conversation with your own editor, and once he has buy-in for a certain project that you want to pursue, then it'll be a lot easier. Unfortunately, you may have to do a lot of the research outside of your current job just to get a foundation together so that you can effectively pitch your editor and say, hey, look, I've done all this research. I know who I'm going to talk to. I know where I'm going to go. You may want to apply for one of these grants so that, again, it takes pressure off your editor to say, I found this grant. It's completely relevant for the story and the project I want to do. If I get it, then you don't have to organize anything. I think you just need to make the job as easy as possible for your editor so it looks like you have everything in hand and the project you want to pursue is not going to detract away from your day job. Editors have a tough job themselves. They need to keep up a particular rate of articles. So yeah, if you can make it easy for them, I think they'll be more likely to pursue those projects. But yeah, you're completely right that it's the independent journalists who are doing the groundbreaking stories because, like you said, they have the time to do this, although they probably suffer from not earning as much potentially.
Thank you so much.
Great. The next question's from Yash. Yash, if you could go ahead.
Hey, hi. This is Yash. Basically, I mean, a lot of times when being the global south and looking at stories here and nearby, it's often not very, I mean, that's what we're made to believe that the data from banks in general, or maybe some international organizations, may not be the best one to look at. So when you, of course, you did mention, getting our data cross-checked. What would be the best way to, get that data cross-checked? Because a lot of times they have their own motives behind, putting a certain kind of data.
Right. So you mean, how can you verify that data produced by international organizations is not biased and motivated?
Yeah, especially banks, because a lot of times they want to push some projects.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in that instance, I think I would definitely reach out to scientists and professionals within India, within local universities, because they are people who have a relationship with people on the ground and also have knowledge of the local context. I noticed that you're from Let India Breathe, and I'm sure that you have a lot of relationships with people around the country who are also invested in this. And basically the way to check the data is to see if it plays out on the ground. This is something that I've never really thought about kind of whether we should be intensely verifying data put out by certain international organizations. Yeah, it's not really like my area of expertise, but I think it can never help. It can never, it can always be a benefit to talk to experts in the field within your own country, within your own state, within your own district, because if there is something which they immediately can put their finger on and say, that doesn't sound right, or that's something I would follow up on, that's a good enough indication. I hope that helps. Sorry, I've never really thought about that before.
No, actually, we've been doing this, writing work and content work for a while now. I mean, 2.5 years now. But only after the EIA campaign in a way hit us is when we got to know, okay, EIA is something that is pushed by banks historically across the world. So we also got to know about this very recently. So we've been finding ways to overcome that.
Yeah, that's an interesting story as well. If you do find discrepancies, things like that. I mean, that would make for a really good governance story of misinformation and that kind of thing. And someone like India Spend or whatever, you could definitely pitch that to them. That would be a good story.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Yash. We have Pranav next. Pranav?
Yeah. So my question was in the context that you spoke regarding safety of journalists, but during reporting, like the tools which you employ while reporting, do you think as a journalist there's a like there are some ethical responsibilities on how we conduct a ground truthing exercise, or if there is a safety issue for the people who you're reporting on? So for instance, how we take a picture of a particular person, whether there's consent given or not, and whether how we how as a when we do this kind of reporting, what sort of, like, because as an academician you're told that ethnography related work you're supposed to have a certain, you even mention all those things in your thesis or your submissions, but as journalists you often don't have these ethical caveats which are mentioned while you do such reporting. So what would be your take on that? And I had one more follow-up question, but yeah.
Okay, I'll just answer this question quickly first. This is definitely something I've thought about. I think there's a difference between obviously journalism and academia, in the sense that when you're writing these stories, you're only really engaging with these topics for at most maybe a month or 2 months. So it does feel that you kind of enter people's lives and leave pretty quickly. So that is something that I've personally sometimes felt bad about. One thing that I like to do is when I'm reporting, obviously, of course, be completely transparent from the beginning, who you are, who you're writing from, and what you're writing about. It can feel a little strange sometimes when you're talking to, someone from a very remote community who obviously wouldn't, and you can't expect them to understand when you say I'm from an online data journalism website. Like, you kind of have to talk to them in their own terms. Always take permission when you take photos, of course. Never take photos of children without parents' permission. And you do have an ethical responsibility to take, I think, dignified photos as well. Especially being from the Global South, writing about the Global South, we do have a responsibility to make sure that it's reported on in a respectful way and change the way that it's been reported on in the past. So that is something that I definitely keep front in mind. At the same time, there's only so much one can do. I felt this very deeply when I was reporting on migrant labor during the beginning of lockdown. I spoke to this guy who was in Surat actually, and he was from Odisha, but he couldn't get across the country, couldn't get back home. And he kept calling me after I'd written the article, asking if I had been able to do anything, meaning like, had I been able to somehow find a way to get him back home or to get him more food. And it was a really horrible experience to not be able to help someone in that capacity, or maybe to have misled someone to think that because I was writing an article about this topic, I also was able to do anything about the challenges that lockdown had brought. I think the best thing the only thing I thought I could do in that situation was just keep talking to him and keep explaining to him, I'm a journalist, this is my job. I will do as much research as possible for other people who could help you, but unfortunately I cannot help you. I think always, just best to kind of always outline and redefine what your job is, what your role is, and what their expectations should be from you, if that makes sense. Does that help?
So just to follow up this idea, because you had mentioned that as a journalist, you have to stick to your science, but why do journalists not want to enter into advocacy spaces as well? Why can't they make call to actions, or they try and bridge the discourse between with activists on the ground and with, I don't know, experts at that level?
I think, like I said, I'm not saying ignore advocacy campaigns, not try to affect change with your journalism. Definitely not. I think there is a very clear mission of what journalism is, and it's to give people all the facts and all the information about a certain topic, and then it's up to people to make their own decisions, right? Like, as a journalist, I am passionate about the environment. I'm passionate about climate change. I want people to engage with the topic and potentially to have read my article and then go and do something about it. But when I write my article, in my article, I shouldn't present my opinion, and I shouldn't present purely the opinion of advocacy groups and campaigners. I should present all views and all opinions. I think journalism and advocacy should be separate. But you can obviously, like, you have publications which have one goal, which may be they're a climate change publication and they only write about climate change. And that is because they are keen for everyone to know the facts about climate change. But in their articles, they will not write calls to action. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Right. I think we have one more question from Chirag.
Hi, Tish. Thank you for that. That was really insightful as an editor as well. So, Aarti and I run the editorial at the Bastion, and very often with the kinds of topics you're talking about, we tend to run series on a set issue. The EIA, FRA in the Northeast, sand mining, like you said. I just wanted to understand, as a freelance journalist, how effective you see series in covering issues. Would you rather do a deep dive 2,500 word story, or would you rather break them up into two pieces? And if so, how do you decide it? And what has been the response like when you do a series versus a deep dive long form piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the advantages to doing a deep dive long form piece is there tends to be a certain style associated with that. That is where you play around with your narrative, you try out different styles of writing. Because it's such a long piece, you want to keep people engaged for the whole time. So the piece I shared about the earthquake in the New Yorker, like that is a great example of using 2,500 words effectively, right? Like you're keeping someone engaged for that time. I think I've definitely written stories in the past that were 3,000 words and could have been 3 stories of 1,000 words. I think at India Spend, especially in the early days, they didn't really tell us to split our stories up, which now, as I was leaving, they were doing that, because there is an art to writing 3 short stories, and that those 3 stories having impact. I think the way you decide whether your story is going to be 3,000 words or 3 times 900, 800 words is if you have too many characters or too many places coming into it. Say you've gone onto the field and you spent a week there, you probably have multiple angles to your stories. And if you find when you're writing that you're coming to a hard break in one of your sections, that section could probably be the end of the story, and you could probably do it again.
Right. Very quick follow-up. But what is the impact, or what is the feedback that you've gotten in terms of creating a movement or actually impacting some form of conversation with a series vis-a-vis a long-form piece? Because they could be targeted at completely different audiences itself.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
If you were, say, trying to create an impact or a movement on a set topic, right? A lot of people on the EIA right now. There is a trade-off between a subject-specific person reading a 2,000-word piece and someone casually interested, your auntie, for example, interested in 3 900-word pieces. What has your experience been with that trade-off? Have you seen a larger or better response in one or the other, or is it specific?
I think definitely subject matter experts love a long piece. They feel confident that you've researched every angle of the topic. They really respond well to that. I think if you want to engage a general audience, then a series is definitely the way to go. And something like the EIA or the FRA, I would definitely do a series, because the issue is going to be long running. So you want to have staggered stories coming out, and there are just so many entry points into it.
Right. Okay, super. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great, thanks. We just have a couple more last-minute questions. We can only take one. So Anvesh, if you could unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Tish. So I wanted to like understand a little better, like what is your process for like figuring out, like say, the operational details of doing your research in remote areas? Like, is it just a matter that you just show up there and start talking to people, or is there some kind of preparation involved? Like even you mentioned, like, you found out about certain groups, like, people who can help you out on the field. So how do you go about like, figuring out all those
Yeah.
details?
Yeah, sure. So I think okay, I'll use an example. So I wrote about this new coal plant that's being built outside of Delhi called the Kurja power plant. And I also wrote about how the coal, which is going to be fed into that power plant, is coming from Madhya Pradesh. So the way I found out about this power plant initially was actually through a Greenpeace report on coal in India. So Greenpeace was my first point of contact. I told them I was interested in this story, and then they put me in touch with some clean air activists in Singrauli, and I spoke to him before I traveled, and then when I got to Singrauli, he then referred me to other people in the area. Obviously I couldn't have predicted that he would refer me to other people in the area, so it's always good to give yourself probably like a week every time you go and report somewhere, because you never know if you need an extra day here or there. Also, before I traveled, because I knew the topic was going to be coal, clean air, the health impacts of breathing in coal dust, I researched who are the experts on this in India, scientists, people in universities. All these people have probably done research in this area. They might know people where you're traveling to, because you're traveling to an energy capital, a pollution hotspot. So they are other people who can help you. And then also, when you're reading around, you'll read other people's work. You'll hear about other activist groups. You'll hear certain names mentioned, and then you just independently find those people's contact details. My theory is if someone's phone number is online, they want it to be. So don't worry about cold calling people and telling them about yourself. Usually that they want you to come and they want to meet you when you're there. But yeah, it's incredible how much you rely on personal references and word of mouth. And also another thing, like, don't over prepare, I think, before you go on a trip, because if you have your trip planned out like every hour of every day, that doesn't leave any time for someone that you meet randomly, or someone that you meet and they say, oh, you must meet this guy in the next village and talk to him and spend time with him. So yeah, you can plan to a certain extent, but you also don't want to plan too much. You just want to feel confident before you travel that you know what you're doing when you get there, and you also have some time to play with as well.
Great. Anvesh, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful.
All right.
Good.
All right, with that, we'll come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Tish, for taking out the time and talking to us. It was
No
really
problem.
insightful. And I mean, there are still a couple of questions, so I'll encourage whoever has questions, please reach out to Tish on her handles, like she said. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This was really great.